The story begins in a quiet, unassuming town, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and nothing extraordinary ever happens. Life moves predictably. Children play in the streets, neighbors chat over fences, and the most exciting event might be the annual fair. But this ordinary setting is about to be disrupted by something unsettling. One day, a strange family moves into the old, dilapidated house on the edge of town. The house itself has been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up, its yard overgrown with weeds. Whispers circulate among the townsfolk. Some say the place is cursed, others claim they've seen shadows moving inside at night, long before the new family arrived. Yet no one can recall the house ever being sold. The newcomers are oddly secretive. The parents are pale and withdrawn, rarely speaking to anyone, their expressions unreadable. The children, if they are even seen, are eerily quiet, never laughing or playing outside like the other kids. They don't attend the local school, and when asked, the parents give vague answers about homeschooling. At first, the townspeople dismiss their unease, chalking it up to the family simply being private or socially awkward. But soon, small, unsettling details emerge. A neighbor might catch a glimpse of the children standing motionless in an upstairs window, staring blankly at the street below. Another might swear they heard unnatural sounds coming from the house at night, whispers that don't sound quite human, or the faint, distant sound of a music box playing a tune no one recognizes. Despite the growing sense of dread, no one takes action. After all, what could they accuse the family of? Being strange? Keeping to themselves? It isn't a crime. But beneath the surface, something is deeply wrong. And by the time the town realizes the truth, it will already be too late for some. This opening scene sets the tone for the story, a slow-building horror, where the real fear lies in what isn't seen, what isn't said. The mystery of the family's origins, the unnatural behavior of the children, and the growing unease among the townsfolk all foreshadow the horrors to come. The stage is set for disappearances, dark secrets, and a terrifying revelation about what or who this family truly is. The story opens with an almost cinematic portrait of a sleepy, forgotten town, a place time seems to have passed by. The kind of town where the sidewalks crack under the weight of dandelions, where the grocery store still has a hand-painted sign, and where everyone locks their doors at night not out of fear, but out of habit. The children ride their bikes until the streetlights flicker on, and the adults trade gossip over coffee at the diner. It's peaceful, predictable, safe. Then, the family arrives. No one sees the moving truck. No one remembers a for sale sign ever being planted in the overgrown yard of the old Victorian house on Hemlock Street, the one with the sagging porch and the attic window that looks like a hollow eye. But one morning, the neighbors notice the front door is no longer boarded shut. Smoke curls from the chimney, and the overgrown weeds at the edge of the property. They've been trampled down, as if something, or someone, has been pacing there at night. The family doesn't introduce themselves. The parents, a man and a woman, both too tall, too thin, are glimpsed only in shadows, their faces oddly smooth, as if carved from wax. They never wave, never stop to chat. When the mailman greets them with a cheerful, "Morning, folks," they stare right through him, their lips pressed into bloodless lines. Then there are the children, 3 of them, always dressed in clothes that seem just slightly wrong, a little too old-fashioned, a little too stiff, like costumes from a faded photograph. They don't attend school. They don't ride bikes or beg for ice cream at the corner store. Instead, they stand at the edges of their yard, watching the other children play with a stillness that makes the hair on the back of necks prickle. little details begin to unsettle the town. Late at night, neighbors swear they hear the faint, off-key tinkle of a music box drifting from the house, but when they press their ears to the walls, the sound stops, as if it was never there at all. A sweet, cloying rot lingers around the property, like spoiled fruit left too long in the sun. The family blames it on a dead raccoon under the porch. No one believes them. More than one person has glanced up at the attic window and seen a small, pale face pressed against the glass, only for it to vanish when they look again. The townspeople tell themselves there's nothing to fear. Strange folks move in all the time, right? But when little Tommy Wilkins vanishes on his way home from baseball practice, and the only clue is a single, tiny handprint on the fence near the Victorian house, a handprint too small to belong to anyone but a child, the whispers turn to shouts, and by then, it's already too late. This opening scene isn't just about setting up a mystery. It's about the slow, creeping dread of realizing that evil doesn't always announce itself with a scream. Sometimes it moves in next door. It watches. It waits. And by the time you notice the signs, you're already part of the story. The town had always been the kind of place where parents let their children run free until dusk, where backpacks were left on front porches without a second thought, where the word stranger was more of a concept than a real danger. But that fragile sense of security was about to shatter like a porcelain doll dropped on hardwood. It started with Emma Calloway. She was 9 years old, with grass-stained knees and a habit of singing made-up songs under her breath. One afternoon, she skipped down Maple Street toward home, her red rain boot splashing in puddles left by the morning storm. A neighbor saw her pause near the old Victorian, tilting her head as if she'd heard something, a whisper, a giggle, the faintest hum of a lullaby. By dinner time, her mother's voice was raw from shouting her name into the gathering dark. They found her backpack at the edge of the woods behind the Victorian, the contents spilled across the damp earth, a half-eaten apple, a notebook filled with doodles of cats, and a single white ribbon that no one recognized. The town held its breath. Then it happened again and again. Liam Hernandez vanished during a game of hide-and-seek, his friends swearing they'd last seen him duck behind the oak tree near the Victorian's fence, the same tree where carved initials now seemed to bleed sap like tears. Sophie Kim disappeared walking home from piano lessons, her sheet music fluttering to the ground near the property line, the final measure of Fur-Elise smudged by something that might have been dirt or might have been tiny, frantic fingerprints. Each disappearance followed the same eerie pattern. No struggle, no screams, just empty spaces where children should have been, a bicycle lying on its side in the road, a jump rope coiled neatly on a swing, a single mitten left behind in the snow, the ribbon factor. Always, somewhere nearby, there'd be a ribbon, white, satin, slightly frayed at the edges, as if it had been tied and untied many times. The whispers. Children who played near the house began reporting soft, sing-song voices calling their names when no one was there. One little girl described a pretty lady with shiny buttons who smiled at her from the attic window, but the family had no women living with them, at least none that anyone had seen. The parents became frantic. The sheriff organized search parties that tramped through the woods with flashlights, their beams cutting through the night like desperate, fleeting prayers. They found nothing, no footprints, no torn clothing, no scent for the dogs to follow. It was as if the children had been plucked from the world by invisible hands, and through it all, the family in the Victorian house remained eerily undisturbed. When confronted, the father, tall, his collar always buttoned too tight, merely blinked and said, Children wander. It's a tragedy, but these things happen. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that made you doubt your own rage. But the townspeople were beginning to notice other things. The way the Victorians' garden, long choked with weeds, now bloomed with strange, waxy flowers that smelled like overripe peaches. The way the family's own children, if they were children, could sometimes be seen at midnight, standing in perfect stillness at their bedroom windows, their small hands pressed against the glass as if testing its strength. And then there were the dreams. Parents began waking in the dead hours before dawn, their hearts pounding, their sheets damp with sweat. They all described the same nightmare, a door creaking open in a house that wasn't theirs, the sound of small feet padding down a hallway, and a voice, soft, insistent, whispering, "I found a new friend to play with." By the time the fifth child disappeared, the town was no longer whispering. It was screaming. This scene isn't just about loss. It's about the unraveling of trust, the slow poison of suspicion, and the horrifying realization that monsters don't always live in the shadows. Sometimes they water their gardens in broad daylight, and no one stops them until it's too late. The first disappearance could have been written off as a tragic accident. The second might still be blamed on coincidence. But by the time the third child vanished without a trace, the town of Willowbrook began to fracture like thin ice under too much weight. The children didn't just disappear, they were erased. Parents became archaeologists of absence, studying the last traces of their children with desperate intensity. A half-finished bowl of cereal left on the kitchen table, the milk still cold. A bedroom window found open just a crack, though no one could remember opening it. School notebooks filled with homework assignments that would never be turned in, the final sentences trailing off into shaky pencil marks as if interrupted mid-thought. The school playground became a haunted place. Swings moved in the breeze with no one pushing them. 4 square courts remained eerily empty. Teachers took attendance with trembling hands, their voices catching when they called out names that would never be answered again. Mothers began sewing bells into their children's clothing. Fathers nailed windows shut and installed extra deadbolts. The local hardware store sold out of motion sensor lights in 3 days. Every house became a fortress, every parent a sentinel standing guard against the night. Yet, the disappearances continued. Little Noah Peterson was last seen chasing a red balloon that had drifted into the Victorians' overgrown yard. His father, watching from across the street, swore he saw small hands reach out from between the hedges to grab the boy, hands that moved too fast with too many fingers. But when he ran to the spot, screaming his son's name, there was nothing. Just the balloon, caught in the branches, its string dangling like a noose. Whispers about the Victorian house grew louder, angrier. The sheriff, a practical man who believed in facts over folklore, found himself staring at case files that defied logic. No footprints, no ransom notes, no bodies. Just a series of family portraits where siblings now stood alone, their missing brothers and sisters fading from photographs like ghosts. At night, parents began seeing things. Shapes moving through backyards too quickly to be human. Pale faces peering from storm drains. The sound of children giggling coming from empty basements. Some claimed to hear their lost sons and daughters calling to them from beneath the floorboards, their voices muffled but unmistakable. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was an epidemic, a haunting, a war being waged against the town's future, one stolen child at a time. And as the people of Willowbrook looked at the Victorian house with new, terrible understanding, they realized 2 things. First, whatever lived there wasn't human. Second, it wasn't finished yet. The disappearances had hollowed out the town, leaving behind a shell of whispered rumors and sleepless nights. The sheriff's office was papered with missing posters, each small face staring blankly from the walls, like ghosts waiting to be remembered. But when the authorities failed to find answers, the people of Willowbrook took matters into their own hands. The reluctant investigator. At the center of it all was Daniel Carter, a high school teacher whose younger brother, Ethan, had been the fourth child to vanish. Daniel wasn't a hero, just a man with a flashlight, frayed nerves, and a grief that had hardened into quiet, simmering rage. He had watched the town's fear curdle into something uglier, neighbors eyeing each other with suspicion, parents locking their children indoors even during daylight, and the slow, creeping realization that whatever was taking the kids wasn't just a person. It wasn't natural. The first break-in. The Victorian house loomed at the edge of town like a rotten tooth in a smiling mouth. Daniel waited until midnight, when the moon was a sliver behind thick clouds, before slipping through the overgrown hedges. The air smelled wrong, thick with the scent of damp earth and something sweetly rotten, like fruit left to spoil in the sun. The back door was unlocked. Inside, the house was a museum of wrongness. The walls were papered in a faded floral print, the patterns shifting if stared at too long. The furniture was draped in yellowed sheets, but the shapes beneath them didn't match chairs or tables. Some bulged oddly, as if hiding something that didn't belong. Upstairs, the floorboards groaned underfoot, whispering secrets with every step. Then, Daniel heard it. A child's voice, faint, muffled, singing a nursery rhyme he hadn't heard since he was a boy. "Hush, little darling, don't make a sound." The investigation spiraled into nightmare. The pull-down ladder was already lowered, dust disturbed in perfect handprints, too small to be an adult's. Inside, the space was too large, impossibly so, stretching farther than the house's dimensions allowed. Dozens of child-sized silhouettes stood frozen in the shadows, their backs turned. None of them moved. None of them breathed. The stairs descended into pitch black, the wood slick with something wet. At the bottom, jars lined the shelves, each filled with murky liquid and floating things. A lock of hair, a finger, a milk tooth. One jar held a pair of eyes, still staring. The parents' room was empty, save for a single rocking chair, moving gently back and forth. On the nightstand sat a music box, its lid open, playing that same off-key lullaby. When Daniel lifted it, he found a ribbon coiled inside, white satin, identical to the ones left at every disappearance. Then he saw them, the family's children. They stood at the end of the hallway, their faces pale and smooth as porcelain. Their smiles stretched too wide, their eyes black and depthless. They didn't blink, they didn't breathe, they just watched. And then, in perfect unison, they whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The escape. Daniel ran. The house fought back. Doors slammed shut on their own. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. Behind him, the sound of small, bare feet pattered against the floorboards, giggling as they gave chase. He barely made it out alive. When he burst through the front door, gasping for air, the street was empty. The house behind him was dark again, silent, as if nothing had happened. But in his pocket, his fingers closed around the ribbon he'd taken. It was still warm. Daniel's story spread like wildfire. Some called him a liar, others a hero. But when the sheriff finally agreed to search the house the next day, they found nothing. No jars, no silhouettes, no music box. Just an empty, dusty old house. And a single white ribbon tied around the attic ladder, waiting for the next child to take it. The Victorian house stood silent under a moon that seemed too pale, too watchful. Daniel Carter's flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he approached, each step crunching on dead leaves that shouldn't have been there in spring. The air smelled of wet earth and something else, something coppery and sweet that made his stomach clench. The missing children's faces flashed in his mind. Emma's gap-toothed smile, Liam's grass-stained knees, his own brother Ethan's nervous habit of chewing his collar. The front door was ajar, though the police swore they'd sealed it. The wood groaned as Daniel pushed it open, the sound too much like a child's whimper. Inside, the house breathed, walls expanding and contracting as if it were alive. The grandfather clock in the foyer was stopped at 3:17 a.m., its pendulum replaced by a small, dirty hand that twitched occasionally. Daniel's breath fogged in air that grew colder with each step. The parlor was furnished in perfect 1920s style, down to the phonograph quietly playing Rock-a-Bye Baby in reverse. Family portraits lined the walls, their faces blurred except for the children. Each generation's kids looked identical to the last. Same hollow eyes, same sharp little teeth. On the coffee table sat a plate of cookies, fresh and warm. The bite marks in them were tiny. The steps creaked underfoot, each groan answered by a giggle from the floors above. The banister felt sticky. When Daniel pulled his hand away, his palm was streaked with something that glistened black in the flashlight beam. Halfway up, he found Ethan's favorite cap dangling from the newel post. It was still damp. 3 small beds stood in perfect formation. The sheets were stained with grass and mud, as if the children had been put to bed without being cleaned. The closet door was ajar, darkness pooling from the crack. Something inside scratched at the wood. Once, twice, then went still. The parents' bed was made with military precision. On the nightstand sat a leather-bound book labeled Harvests in gold foil. Inside, Daniel found dates going back to 1883, names of children he didn't recognize, recipes involving ingredients like first tears and laughter strained through cheesecloth. Beneath the bed, something rustled. A small hand emerged, then retracted, dragging what looked like a jump rope behind it. The attic. The pull-down ladder was already lowered, dust disturbed in perfect handprints. The air smelled of burnt sugar and wet dog. Dolls hung from the rafters by their necks, not store-bought dolls, but crude things made from sticks and hair and scraps of clothing Daniel recognized. Their button eyes followed him as he moved. In the corner sat a little girl in a tattered yellow dress. "Are you here to play?" she asked, her voice the crackle of a long-dead radio. When she turned, her face was smooth as an egg. The basement. The stairs descended into blackness so complete it felt solid. Halfway down, Daniel's light caught the jars, rows upon rows of them, each containing milk teeth floating in amber liquid, fingers pickled like cocktail onions, eyes that tracked the light. At the center of the room stood a wooden table. The stains there were older than the town itself. The escape. The house turned against him then. Doors slammed, walls pulsed. From every shadow came the sound of bare feet slapping against hardwood. Daniel burst through the kitchen door into the overgrown yard, where the family's children stood in a perfect circle, holding hands. Their heads turned in unison as he ran past, their mouths opening too wide, showing too many teeth. The last thing he saw before the hedges swallowed him whole was the attic light flickering on, revealing dozens of small faces pressed against the glass. Watching, waiting, hungry. When dawn came, the house stood pristine. No mud on the floors, no jars in the basement, No little girl in the attic. But if you pressed your ear to the front door at exactly 3:17 a.m., you could hear it, the sound of something chewing. And if you looked closely at the family's children the next day, you might notice their cheeks were a little fuller, their smiles a little brighter, their eyes a little more familiar. This investigation peels back the layers of the house's true nature. The truth is worse than anyone imagined. The children aren't just victims. They're being remade, preserved, collected. And the town's about to meet the newest members of the family. The town had gathered in the dim light of the church basement, their faces drawn tight with sleepless nights and gnawing dread. Daniel Carter stood before them, his hands shaking as he laid out the artifacts of nightmare on the old wooden table. The leather-bound ledger labeled harvests, the jar with its floating, sightless eye, the white satin ribbon that still carried the faint scent of lilac and decay. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and fear, of coffee gone cold hours ago, of the copper penny smell that comes before rain or violence. Then the whispers began. Mrs. Henderson, her voice cracked like dry kindling, was the first to say it aloud. "They're eating our children." And the truth, once spoken, could not be unspoken. The book's pages crackled like old skin as Daniel turned them, revealing entries that spanned generations. June 3rd, 1883, Timothy Clark, aged 8. Sweet marrow, fine texture. The mother's grief was particularly flavorful. October 31st, 1927. Twins Alice and Andrew Boyd. The left one's laughter made excellent sauce. Last Thursday, Ethan Carter. Brother's rage adds a pleasant spice to the kidneys. Each entry was written in meticulous cursive, the ink sometimes brown with age, sometimes still glistening red. The dates corresponded perfectly with Willowbrook's long history of unsolved disappearances, gaps in the town's memory that had always been explained away as runaways, accidents, those things that happen sometimes. This was no simple hunger. The family, if they had ever been human, practiced a slow, ritualistic consumption. Taken while the child still lived, usually a fingertip or lock of hair, smuggled home in a pocket while the victim slept unaware. This bound them to the house. Over weeks, the family would siphon something intangible. A laugh stolen mid-playground giggle, a tear licked from a cheek during a scraped knee. The very idea of bedtime stories sucked from a mother's mind as she read them. When the child was plump with stolen love and terror, they were led smiling to the Victorian's basement, where the old porcelain bathtub stood waiting. Father Driscoll crossed himself when Daniel described the tub's stains, how the claw-foot legs ended in tiny, grasping hands. Not all victims stayed dead. Some returned days later, seemingly unharmed, but they never blinked. Their shadows moved a half-second too slow. They developed sudden allergies to sunlight and church bells. These changelings would live normal lives until adulthood, when they'd inevitably inherit the Victorian and begin the cycle anew. The town had been nourishing its own horror for over a century, generation after generation fattening up their young for the harvest. The Victorian wasn't a home. It was a living thing, its walls pulsing with stolen breath, its foundation stones cemented with ground bone. The family were merely its caretakers, bound to feed it as it fed them. The attic was its mouth, the basement its stomach. The children's laughter echoing through its halls, just digestion. As the townsfolk sat paralyzed by the horror, old man Peterson, who'd lived on Hemlock Street since the 1950s, let out a wet, choking sound. "My sister," he whispered. "She went missing in '58. Came back a week later saying she'd been camping. She lives in Chicago now, has 3 kids of her own." The room went deathly still, because the Victorians' family had relatives now, in every major city, in countless towns, all of them waiting patiently for their own hungers to wake. And in the silence, if you listened closely, you could hear the house on the hill, laughing. Now the town must decide. Burn the house and risk the wrath of whatever ancient thing dwells within, or flee and let the horror spread. But as they argue, the church lights flicker, the windows frost over, and from the street outside comes the sound of small, bare feet, hundreds of them, marching in perfect unison toward the doors. The harvest, it seems, has come to them. The church doors rattled on their hinges as the thing that had once been Willowbrook held its breath. Outside, the scraping of small hands against wood, the wet sound of too many mouths breathing in unison. Inside, the townspeople clutched each other, their faces slick with terror and kerosene, Daniel's doing. He'd raided the hardware store on the way here, passed out fuel and matches with the grim efficiency of a man who'd already mourned. Glass rained down as a dozen small, pale forms wriggled through like eels. They moved all wrong, joints bending backward, fingers spidering across floors and pews, their bellies distended from recent meals. Mrs. Henderson screamed when she recognized Liam's favorite dinosaur shirt stretched across one creature's swollen torso. The fire took hungrily, racing across kerosene trails, licking up walls and over the crawling things. They didn't scream. They giggled, high and shrill, as their skin blackened and split like roasting chestnuts. The townspeople learned this when charred fingers closed around ankles, when half-burned children rose from the flames with their meat sloughing off, still advancing. They fled toward the Victorian because where else could they go? The house stood wide awake now, its windows glowing like eyes, its porch steps creaking in welcome. The front door yawned open, revealing a hallway lined with tiny coats and shoes, all the missing children's belongings neatly hung and waiting. And sitting at the dining table, the family waited with their best china laid out. The mother smiled, her lips stitched shut with black thread. "You're just in time," she said, though her mouth didn't move. The table was set for everyone. Each plate held a single, recognizable item, Emma's pink hair ribbon coiled like a worm in broth, Ethan's baby tooth resting on a bed of wilted greens, a ladle floating in the tureen, its bowl made from little Tommy's kneecap. Daniel raised his gas can. The father sighed, disappointed. "We'll just start again, somewhere new." 3 months later, a cheerful realtor showed a lovely Victorian to a young couple from out of state. "Great neighborhood," she said, stepping over a faint black stain on the porch. "Very safe for children." In the attic, something scratched eagerly at the floorboards. And deep in the basement, if you listened closely, you could hear the wet, rhythmic sound of something chewing. This ending offers no clean victory, only the grim understanding that some hungers cannot be killed, only passed along. The tragedy isn't just the lost children, it's the realization that horror wears many faces, and the next one might look like your neighbor. The air in Willowbrook tasted of copper and burning hair as the last survivors stumbled toward the Victorian. Daniel Carter dragged his gasoline can, its sloshing contents the only liquid left in a town gone bone dry. Behind them, the church bell tolled without human hands, a deep, sickening gong that shook the earth like a dying heartbeat. The Victorian was no longer a structure of wood and nails. Its gables arched like ribs, its windows pulsed with a slow, sickly rhythm. The front door hung open, a slack mouth breathing out the scent of spoiled milk and birthday cake. From within came the sound of a piano playing itself, the notes all wrong, the melody, something between a lullaby and a scream. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye for now.